Well, here it is then, the brand new Sauber C37, or to give it its new full title, the Alfa Romeo Sauber C37. And I've got to say, and I didn't think I'd be saying this before I saw this car, this is one of the most interesting F1 cars I've seen so far from the few that have been released. Certainly in the way that it's innovative in its design. It's got a few really interesting key features about the design of this thing. So we'll talk you through some of them now. Now, obviously the nose cone is slightly different. That's the first thing that stands out. It's got kind of two nostrils, and a little bit like Force India have run in the past. This is about driving airflow, excuse me, through these holes, through these nostrils here. There's also, you can't see on the picture, but there's an opening underneath. So airflow will be passing through there, but also through these two channels and being driven underneath, following the contour of the nose line and through to that centre section that we've talked about before, where it's then fed out and distributed out past the barge boards, through the side pods and towards the back of the car. So again, just another take on the way that you speed up and streamline that airflow passing from the front of the car, trying to get it through towards the key areas as cleanly as possible. But, you know, an interesting detail. My voice is almost going, so bear with me here. There's an S-duct at the top of the nose, like we've seen on them all so far. A few more details again on the front wing, but as you now know, not one of my big areas of interest, the front wing at this stage. The front suspension, I'm going to actually change the picture to a lower angle here. The front suspension is very, certainly the top wishbones particularly, very highly mounted. A little bit like the Red Bull solution that we saw coming out on Monday. We've got very high mounts with an outboard flexure again, almost coming out to a point where the flexure is before it then almost parallel, tapers down slightly. But this has been achieved by putting a big extension arm from the top of the outboard upright here, a little bit like Mercedes did in 2017, but even more extreme. So the mounting point, the attachment point for that front top wishbone, which normally would mount directly onto the top of the upright, now attaches to this extension arm, which comes inboard and upwards, and basically means that that front wishbone can travel almost parallel and be much higher up and out of the airflow, the airstream. You give a much wider gap for the airstream to pass through that front suspension. So it's an idea that Mercedes kind of tried out last year. Sauber have taken that one step further and really pushed it up even further to try and open out this area and allow a clean flow through that turbulent area of suspension. So that's quite interesting itself. Not an easy thing technically to achieve, because the loads that are going through these pieces, this little extension arm, are pretty extreme as the car is bouncing around a racetrack. So that piece is not an easy piece to manufacture to be able to take the loads that it needs to take. The side view of the car starts to show a little bit of detail around the barge boards areas and these vertical vanes that lots of teams are now using. But what's really interesting for me about this, being a Sauber, and given that previous Saubers have been very basic really in some of these detailed or less than detailed aerodynamic devices around the car, really simple, almost GP2 or F2 like vanes and devices that are around these areas on previous Saubers. This one looks like it's had a lot more attention to detail, a lot more thought process gone into it. And there are a lot more intricate details in the way these things are shaped, the way they're mounted to each other, and the way that the overall design fits together. That's really interesting for me. That shows a new concept for Sauber. And they said it in their press release that this is a completely new way of thinking about the aerodynamics from this car, a complete departure from the previous version of the car, the C36. They've gone about this in a completely new way, and you can see that from lots of different areas. So the barge boards, a lot more intricate, as I say, a lot lower than we've seen on some of the other cars, certainly around the typical barge board area with a turning vane or a guide vane on the side of the chassis here. Another one up here. Before we get to these three vertical vanes that are very twisted, very profiled in the way they're deliberately shaping airflow around these side pods, towards the side pods, and around, you know, controlling this airflow around the side of the car. Right, this view of the car gives you a better appreciation of what they've done around the side pod area. And that is one of the really innovative areas, completely different to the solutions that any other team so far have come up with. I've not seen this before on a Formula One car, in that they have not only done this very clever, intricate system of boards and deflectors around here, but the actual side pod openings are very different as well. They've actually split the inlet into the side pod cooling areas into two. So they've got this low slung inlet here, very narrow, close to the side of the chassis. Above it, not that you can quite see it on this picture, but just above here, there's another opening, another inlet for the airflow to go in and affect various cooling. Not sure how they're going to be split internally, of course, but it gives them two different options on flow stream and going into where they direct that once it gets into the bodywork and which areas it cools. What they have done, which goes against the current grain of thinking, is they have put a rather more typical crash structure up high. So this piece here is the crash structure. All teams have to have this crash structure. But what we've seen typically this year, off the back of what Ferrari did last year, was have that much, much lower in the car and sit the air intake behind that and up above it into a sort of lower, narrower air intake. Sauber have gone completely the other way. There's very low, narrow intake here, which is probably the main radiator feed, and then this other one above the crash structure. So they've given themselves a much bigger area through here between the intake and these turning vanes to guide airflow through, follow the profile of the bodywork round, and then using the Coanda effect that we were all talking about years ago, following that airflow, sticking it to the side of the bodywork and sending it off through towards the rear of the car and the diffuser. So a really interesting take on it. Another guide vane, of course, parallel here with a little vortex generator as a stay holding that up. And that little separator there will be guiding airflow into that top opening. So I thought a really interesting, a really nice and innovative way of doing things. What I like in Formula One, and what I've always liked in Formula One, is when people innovate, when people come up with new ideas of their own. And this, you know, whether it works or not, it still remains to be seen. But it's a nice, clever, neat and thoughtful solution. They've also done a similar thing up here on the engine air intake. So they've split that into not two, but three little intakes here. So there's a very narrow one here, a larger one here, and another one off the back, piggyback onto it here. There's actually another little inlet here, which will also, off the back of this shark fin, there's another small inlet vane, which will allow more airflow to go in and cool another part of that power unit in there. So again, I don't think we've seen this, not this year at least. Teams have split that air intake in the past, but what we've seen so far, since the advent of the Halo, is going for a sort of larger, higher up air intake for the engine, whereas here they haven't done that. They split it into two or three smaller inlets. And again, I don't know whether it's going to work or not. They've obviously seen something in their wind tunnel, in their CFD solution, CFD comparisons that shows them that it works. And again, I like it because it's different. They're really thinking very differently. Sauber are also the first team to start showing off at the launch stage the little aerodynamic device mounted to the top of the Halo. I fully expect all teams to be utilising the freedom that they have, a small amount of freedom around this Halo for little winglets and aerofoils, all used to start guiding the airflow from the Halo. The Halo is going to be a very disruptive device. It's not aerodynamically profiled in any way. So these little areas that they can put these winglets and aerofoils on are all going to be there to clean up the airflow over the Halo and around the driver's helmet and guide it into these air intakes and to the places they need it around the back of the car. Very low slung mirrors and out wide like we've seen before to get around the back of the Halo for the driver's view. But some innovative areas around this section of the car, and I really like that. Looking round towards the rear of the car then, we can see in a bit more detail these elements on the side of the side pods here and how they are kind of profiled and contoured to manage the airflow heading towards the back of the car. You can also just see the minimal sort of shark's fin with that vent that I was talking about, that inlet up here, guiding air down towards the back of the gearbox, probably a gearbox cooler or something like that. You can see the diffuser here, quite a large, very unclear from the pictures unfortunately, but quite a large expansion, aggressive expansion on the back of the diffuser to try and generate downforce that way, and quite a lot more detail than we've seen in the past Saubers on there as well. So that's also something that clearly has had a lot of effort and thought put into it. Rear wing end plate detail as well. Not going to get too much into that because again, like the front wing, these elements will change on a rapid basis as they always do. There is no T-wing on the back of this car, as we saw on, I think, on the Red Bull and certainly on the Williams. There was a lower T-wing, not one yet on the back of the Sauber. Again, an area that could well change in the coming months. But there is a little flip up, a little sort of almost like a little kick plate on the back of a skateboard, overhanging the rear light there. Again, just for a little bit of extra downforce and also to help the airflow coming off here. It's a small area that you can utilise, minimal effect, but it will help the airflow in conjunction with the underside of the rear wing and the lower the lower plane of the rear wing as well, just to help the tail off as the airflow departs the car. It's as important as controlling the airflow as it leaves the car as it is as it's passing over the car and all the little details around it. So you've got to get a controlled exit of all your airflow after it's passed over the car to make it efficient as well. Definitely not as tight and slimmed down around the Coke bottle area as we saw on the Red Bull. The Red Bull via Adrian Newey is always an extreme example of that. The thinner you can get it here, of course, the more efficient the airflow will be, the less draggy it will be, and the more you can work the airflow in towards, coming around these side pods, in towards this crucial area at the back of the car where the diffuser sits. So they haven't managed to suck that in as narrowly as perhaps some of the other teams, certainly not the Red Bull. But even so, a lot of nice detail, which is a really nice thing to see from a back-of-the-grid team like Sauber. Well, there it is, the C37 Alfa Romeo Sauber 2018 Formula 1 car. I've got to say, I like it. As I said at the beginning, I'll like it a lot if it's fast. Don't forget, this car now has the 2018, so the current Ferrari spec power unit in it, as opposed to last year, which had the year-old Ferrari unit. This team last year were up to 4 seconds off the pace of the front runners at lots of circuits. Don't forget, a new driver for this team in Charles Leclerc, who's a bright young thing, part of the young Ferrari driver academy. Lots of input, of course, from Ferrari through the Alfa Romeo brand in this thing. New team principal in Fred Vasseur, new sponsors, new partners on board, a new aerodynamic approach, and what I hope is going to bring them some new results. I think we all do. It would be great to see Charles Leclerc and, of course, Marcus Ericsson moving much further up towards the rest of the pack and really mixing it with the rear of the field, perhaps even the tail end of the midfield. But so far, without seeing on a track, I like it.